Welcome to Getting Ghosted. This is an Intuitive Soul Collective podcast, and I'm your host, Allie Horner. Hello, everybody. It's Allie. I'm back. I just returned from a trip to California to visit my sister and her husband. And yeah, it was just a lovely, refreshing trip. We had some good sister bonding time, did some really cool little tours and bopped around the city. And now I'm just back and, came back clear-headed and I'm ready and refreshed to jump into channeling. And we have Anna who is back. If you guys haven't listened to my channelings with Anna in the past, you will be able to go into the Getting Ghosted podcast, scroll down a little bit, and you'll see part 1 and part 2. Definitely listen to those before you listen to this part 3 episode. Anna is from 200 years in the future, and she has been popping in to share certain things with us about Earth's future, about our history, about renewable energy, and about humanity. And so each time I've channeled her and put the interviews out there, people have come back with some really cool questions. And so I thought that this episode, we could see a little bit more of what Anna is ready to share with us, call her in. She's definitely been popping through today and is ready to talk and chat. So I let her know that we would have some questions, and she was like, shoot, go for it. Now, I got some wonderful questions from some people. So this one comes in from Shelby. And Shelby asked, if you channel with Anna again, I would love if you could ask her about women's rights and if there's more of a matriarchal society in place instead of a patriarchal one during her time period. And so I'm going to let Anna kind of take that and roll with it. So Anna is saying, it's not as patriarchal as it sounds. And she said, there was a great shift. She said that there was she said a larger change, and she said it sort of shifted over time, but she's showing there were also some revolutions over time as well. And she said, now there are different societies that adopted different sort of like principles. And she said, but there were some things that made everyone start to work together as one more. And she said, so there's more of a collective and shared unity now than there ever has been before. She said, it's not a perfect system. We're very much still human. And she said, people still have the power to corrupt and dominate and things like that. But the center of humanity is less about just one person, like a hierarchical model of one person being in charge. Rather, most of humanity has adopted more of an ecosystem that's more natural. And she said, suppressing humans' rights really doesn't really go along with, she said it kind of goes along with like egoic consciousness. And she said, of course, there's still crime and greed and corruption, but it's not quite at the same frequency. It's less sustainable now. And she said it's also much easier to find out. And she's showing something to do with technological advances and tracking. She said there are different technology advances that have happened over time that have made it less easy for people to exist in those frequencies or in those mind sets. She said, but there are, of course, still people who get away with those things. And she said, I'm explaining this because I want you to understand that in terms of like patriarchy, when you think about hierarchical systems of government, she said, those aren't as popular now. And she said, there are some communities and areas in the world that exist more with a sort of leadership around them. And she said, but there are much more councils. And she said, now I want you to understand this because it's not just about different country type of councils, like how it is when you're alive. She said, it's more like we have more of a shared ecosystem. It's much more sustainable. We understand the earth. And she said there's been many shifts in how people perceive things because of some of the natural events and things that happened over the last 2 centuries, which caused us all to work together more. And so she said that it's more like there's like kind of like higher councils. And she said there's almost like higher councils, but it's like groups of people. And she said, you know how you guys have the UN? And I said, yes. And she said, it's somewhat like that, but less like elected officials. It's more like people who care about certain pieces, like gathering. She said there's much more ease with telecommunications, and autonomy allows people to communicate with people in other countries much more easily. And she said in your time period, certain countries are disconnected and not able to communicate with certain people in different parts of the world as easily. She said this isn't the case here in our time frame. And she said, of course, there's still some systems of oppression, but we've really reached beyond that. And she said, I don't want you to get scared or worried, because a lot of people fear like a one world order sort of like thing, like a conspiracy theory. And she said, but it's more so that we are working through some of those patriarchal, like one man in charge type of systems. And she said there are some communities, more rural, who do have a little bit more of that patriarchal norm or system, but they're really outgrowing them as well. And she said a lot of the advances that we've made in terms of technology and sustainability have actually squashed those systems. And she said, you see, a lot of these things are interwoven. So when you look at like your technological systems, your economic systems, the environment and sustainability, your energy systems, your, how you guys think about who's in charge and who gets to be in charge and why, those things are all woven together. And she said, it's very difficult to explain, but you kind of have to look at it, hindsight being 2020. And I was asking her, well, was there a one event that caused a lot of change? And she said, yes, it was environmental impact. And she said there was a larger sweeping change that occurred. And she said, she's showing me again a map of the US, and there's a lot of areas along the coast that are underwater. Like I see like Florida has turned into, most of the peninsula is gone, and there's like a piece that looks like an island kind of out in central to almost southern Florida. But I'm seeing things underwater. I'm seeing like the southern portions of the US underwater. I don't see Central America as much anymore. It looks like a lot of that's going underwater, like that strip. And she said, yes, unfortunately, there were some environmental changes for us, at least in our time frame. And she said that made these changes happen, and it caused many parts of the world to have to change how they were thinking about things, how they were doing things, because many of them were impacted as such. And there was kind of a collective awakening around sustainability and environmental impact, which she said that's a very hard thing for patriarchal systems to work with, because patriarchal systems look at it like us versus them, me versus you. They're more warfaring and control and domination. And, I'll do me, you do you. I'm here to like take care of me, myself, and mine. And she said, and that had to go away very quickly. Many people were forced out of those habits, and leaders who wanted to dominate, control, etc., just kind of naturally fell away by the wayside, because the people were like, we have to do something. We have to work together with each other around the world to help each other to, she said there was kind of a collective shift and change and uprising that happened very rapidly because of some of these natural events that were happening to the larger ecosystem. And she's been trying to tell me over and over in my mind, like the ecosystem. And I was like, so it was a larger thing that happened around the world that affected the environment and the ecosystem that caused some of the downfall of patriarchal systems. And she said, yes. And she said, you can't have people who want to be in control and warring against each other in the middle of like economic collapse or environmental collapse. She said, it just isn't sustainable. Like you kind of have to there were people who put their differences aside to work together and band together to protect the people, and she said they really made the most of it. And it really became a beautiful part in Earth's history. She said, I don't want you to be worried, upset, or scared. And she said, but I wouldn't invest heavily in property on the coastlines. I was telling her in my mind, my spiritual guides have said this, before in the past. And she said, and they were right too. And she said, now a lot of these changes won't happen like tomorrow or overnight. You would have some time, but there will be more flooding and things like that coming in the near future. So she wanted us to understand that. And she said, now in terms of patriarchal systems, a lot of systems, they're not quite matriarchal yet, but they're more circular in structure, if that's what you mean. And she said, so more of these systems are more communal. Like there's more of an understanding of how humanity has to work together with the larger ecosystem and therefore with each other, which means there's less of this like me versus you, us versus them. It's more of a we mentality. And she said that I wouldn't quite call this matriarchy, but it is a shift away from patriarchy or top-down or hierarchical systems, which is what this person's really trying to ask for. And she said, now in terms of family systems, yes, there is less of the understanding that, a man has to be head of the household, et cetera. And she said, now some people do still have these family systems in place. It's more of, a single nuclear family, but that family in most cases, not all, she said, not all, but many cases is more integrated with larger community. And so there's much more communal living. And she said some of this also changed because of environmental impacts and economic impacts, which changed housing in many parts of the world. And she said, so even in your area, the US, there's nuclear family housing. You have nuclear family structures. You've been really taught to have, have people have to have their own homes, et cetera. She said, you already see that dying out. And I said, yes, that's greatly decreased in the last 20 years. And she said, and I would say even prior to that, but it's really decreasing now. And she said, yes, so that's exactly it. There's a shift and a change moving toward more multi-generational housing that really is starting in your time frame. And she was showing me, she said, it's not out of anything necessarily bad happening, but she said there is a change happening. So she said, think about it. When a household changes in this way, this also contributes to less of a patriarchal system within the household. And she said, now think about that happening on a wide scale. I was like, okay, interesting. Because I know there's definitely countries and communities in certain parts of the world where this is the norm already. It's never not been the norm. And she said, yes, that's exactly it. And she said, this will be more and more of the norm. And I was asking her like about how long in the US or North America would you say? And she said, she was showing me 2066. And she said there are going to be bigger changes coming and more changes coming globally that will contribute to this. But she said, I don't want anyone to get scared. It's nothing scary. She keeps saying that. She was like, people are going to listen to your work and they're going to have like a moment of freak out. And I was like, that's okay. I appreciate that. Now this kind of feeds into our next question from Shelby. And so she said, I listened to the podcast where you spoke with humans thousands of years in the future. And you guys can find that. You'll have to scroll back a bit when you go into the podcast, your podcast app, or I can pop it into the show notes. But there was one where we channeled people from 6,000 years in the future. And she said, and I found the snippet about how they view romantic relationships to be so cool. I know that obviously relationships have changed from 250 years ago when women couldn't even speak to men alone if they weren't related or married to them. And wonder if Anna wouldn't mind giving insight into how romantic relationships have changed or evolved in the future. And so Anna is saying, well, so think about some of the things that I've already been kind of explaining about the changes in society and people working together. And she said, so as things shifted and changed, part of what happened as well is it wasn't just about the environment. Also, there were things that caused people to want to work together, she said, you're seeing this in your time frame. More and more people are wanting to stay single. She said there's also hereditary changes happening. And she said this is something we learned about in our historical, guides. And she said we learned about evolutionary changes happening in humanity and also how some of your practices and she's showing lead and hormone disrupting things, over-reliance on plastics and metals, the environment getting worse, the air quality, water quality. She said there's many hormone disrupting chemicals and things in your ecosystem, in your time frame. She said this caused a decline in the population. She said, this is something important for you to understand because you're going to see this happening. And she said, but miscarriages really grew, as well as people having hormone disruptions, which made it very difficult for them to get pregnant or to carry pregnancies to full term. And so she said, so essentially what happened is this happened globally and more people found themselves struggling to get pregnant. There were also obviously the economic changes that you're seeing already And some of this is people going, we need an end to patriarchy. Some of it is people being tired of being treated a certain way, tired of not having the same rights, like some of the certain things that are happening here and in many parts of the globe. And she said, so that was a big part of the change. And she said, we actually studied this in school here. And I was like, oh, interesting. And she said, because the time period you're in is it's big, it's important. And she said, that's why we selected you in your time frame to come and talk to. And so Anna's saying as well, when I was looking into this in terms of my studies, also what began to happen was you began to have romantic changes in how you thought about romance and the family system in your time frame, in your society. But this was also shifting and changing in other parts of the world because of, she said, increased telepathic ability. So people starting to pick up on each other's thoughts and not realizing that this isn't just my own way of thinking. This is, and she said, so it's easier for global thought to become a future, but you can also have sovereignty in individual. Now, the other piece is, she said, I don't want you to get scared by that. That's a natural part of the human process. But she said, we still have our own things too, but we understand these things happening and exist. It's just different for us. Now, the other piece is, she said, now more and more of your people are communicating with each other and starting to talk and going, wait, you're going through this? I'm going through this. Wait, this is happening to you. This is happening to me. You're starting to change how you're thinking about this. I am too. And so she said, there is a big time period and big change that's happening, and it will continue to happen for a while, in which people are changing how they feel and think about the economy, the marital systems, relationships, love. And she said, it's a great resurgence of the sovereign self. And I was like, yeah, my guides have been talking about this for a really, really, really long time, like the last decade and a half. And she was like, yeah. And she goes, that's fascinating. I would believe that. And she said, now in terms of how that impacts us in the future, people still have relationships in the future, but we are much more loving. We're much more open-minded about relationships. It's not a perfect society yet. There is still violence around certain things. There's still racial violence. There's still domestic violence. She said these things are much more punishable now. There are still problems, right? And she said, but we think about relationships a little bit differently. They're more at will. We don't have as many of the legal systems that bind you to them. And she said, it makes it easier for us to also have more autonomy as a society and as a people. She said there's more trust. So when we do enter into relationships, we don't have to have a legally binding contract that says that we're married or with someone. And she said there's more legal processes and protections for women and children. And there are also more protections and processes that allow us to sustain what we have without having to be in a relationship to have it. And she said, so many of us, while we do have, relationships and we have partnerships, and many people do have, she's showing union, people getting married, but it's more of being united versus having to have a big wedding and stuff. She said, we have much more of a process that allows us to remain legally and financially autonomous with she's showing like I said, so are you talking about taxes and stuff? And she said, yes, that's part of it. We don't have you get a big tax write-off for for being married, but a single mother wouldn't get the same tax write-off, she said, and wouldn't get any additional help. And she said, we have very different systems around that. So it's easier to remain sovereign and single. And she said, we don't have as many people who balk at it. It's much more autonomous and accepted that people might want to just have platonic communities and relationships. She said, we've really grown into that more. It's much more fitting. It allows for a lot less partner on partner violence. And there's a lot less ownership over women and children. They're not seen as property by law anymore. And I was like, well, thank goodness for that. And then she said, so we think about relationships differently. And she said, this is a big difference because instead of, for example, someone needing to be with someone else out of financial need or strain or whatever, they just want to be with them. And I was like, oh my God, my guides have been talking about this forever. They've said it to people in readings for years. It's when they've been trying to guide them with romance and stuff. And she said, it's very common in your time periods where you're kind of outgrowing this, for people to struggle with, well, if I'm not needed, then how do I handle being just wanted? And what do I do if no one wants me? And she said, that's a big growth shift that you're having in your current time period. This is a time period in which it's very difficult for many people to understand, what place do I have in the home and society if I'm not needed? And she said, but also some people feel very at home in this. They feel very at home and like, yes, of course I'm here. I want to be here. I don't need to be here, but I want to be here. I like this person. She said that's more of what society evolves into before our time frame. She said, to be fair, a lot of things do take time, but it also, if you think about it, doesn't take much time at all. And then she said, so in that sense, because people have more autonomy, there's less supports for people to, she said, like, for example, like age-related assaults and attacks and things like that. She said, we have less issues with, like, she said, like CSA, like child sexual assault. She said, because a lot of people are happier and healthier. Now, she said, there's not like nothing that happens that's bad, but she said it's dealt with very differently. And she said, this is where you can see that patriarchal stuff, going away. This is where you can see a lot of that, like when you don't see people as property, or you aren't othering them. You're not just objectifying them as a body. It's less likely to be that violence. And because you see them, they're a human being to you. They have feelings and thoughts, and that empathy has grown. And she said, so it's not that we don't have any crime or don't have any issues here, but there's less likely to be things where it's like assaults, attacks. She said they're less frequent. They're kind of like, she said, what would you say, like, was something you're kind of like evolving out of it? And she said, now again, it's not gone. She said, we also have different gene editing technology, and we have more preventative healthcare and health measures, as I mentioned. She's showing people, them having some sort of technology where you can do something with the brain, inside the brain, that can actually change how people... And I was asking her, can you explain what you're showing me in a little bit more detail? She said, well, we do have some gene editing technology and some technology that can kind of, she said, like, really get in there in the brain. And what it can help with is essentially if someone has, for example, a part of their brain that's not working well, that's causing them to have violent thoughts, or like they have like chronic negative thinking, or, you know what I mean? She was saying we do have gene editing technology and technology that can kind of go inside the brain, inside the mind. And she said it's very revolutionary. This technology can sort of like get in there, and she's showing it working on different parts of the brain, like the gray matter. And she said it can almost kind of pinpoint where something is happening or wrong inside the brain and get in there and almost... She said, almost like surgically edit it, but it's a different type of technology. It's not a surgery. It's something to do with like a light technology. She said, it's very difficult to describe in your current time frame because it doesn't exist yet. And I was like, okay, I'll accept that answer. And she said, but we do have gene editing. And so she said, sometimes you do have some of these sort of like propensities for violence, or certain things like that cause people to harm each other or see each other as objects versus having empathy, right? Sensing, feeling, understanding what other people are feeling because you feel it too. Shared emotions, collective things. She said there is some new technology that's come out over the years that has allowed for some gene editing and shifting technology that can help families where they have like a history of like systemic abuses. That has been, she said, it's been a very revolutionary technology. And she said, it's not fully widespread yet, but it has been coming, and they have recognized there are certain genes and certain things in DNA. She said, I understand this is difficult to kind of describe and really take in, but there are certain things they found that cause people to do certain things to harm people. Right. They have more of that like they're more likely to do that. Right. And she said, it's not just, oh, it was done to me, now I do it to others. It's not that simple all the time. And she said, sometimes something just happens within the person's genetics within their brain, and it causes a change in their brain. And all of a sudden they're obsessing about harming someone or hurting someone. They're objectifying people, etc. And she said, so there has been some technology that's come about to help sort of revolutionize that and shift that. She said, now it's still in motion. We're still working on it, but that is more prevalent now. It's more pronounced now. And she said, we also have more preventative medicine. And this is one of the ways is she's showing certain things on that note that are like, don't have to do with like compulsions or thoughts of harming yourself or others, etc. She's showing like certain terminal illnesses and stuff that they've been working to edit out of people's genetics. And she said, I won't go too far into that because I know this person asked about relationships, but I want you to understand some of the things that are sort of like impacting the relationships of the future. Now, she said, the other piece is with relationships, there's just more autonomy. So she said a lot of people are together, but they live in separate dwellings, or they still have communication and connection with the family home because there's more multi-generational dwellings. She said there's been a large change as well in how people live and how they want to live. And so relationships, like romantic relationships, are not like the end all be all of society. She said a lot of people have ceremonies still, but it's not like gigantic, expensive things. It's more quiet. And she said people take more time and have more intention before they go into a relationship. Often they know each other for quite a while versus meeting someone and just jumping in like both feet first, and she said like, we're much more intentional. And she said, now again, some people do have that like love at first sight, type of thing. And she said, people do, have endings and beginnings in relationships, but it's much less patriarchal in much of the world. It is different in quite a way. And she said, now that said, there are some new things that are coming about with relationships for us as well. And one of which is that we think a little bit more clearly because of this renewable energy that's impacted our senses. So we see things a lot more clearly now than you might in your time period. And she said, we also don't allow lead, and we don't allow certain chemicals into the air or the environment that would keep us from thinking about other people as valuable human beings. We don't have as many of those issues with like that lead or the chemicals poisoning the brain and the body, which makes you think violent thoughts or think bad things or lose cognitive function and ability or lose your memory, get brain fog. We don't have as many of those things because we've worked much more on sustainable energy and resources. And she said, it's not just energy, it's like what materials we use, how things are built, how things function. And she said, we do have more time. We're closer to the earth. We garden, everyone gardens. There's time spent outside every day. The soil's much richer and filled with more nutrients. We have more nutrient density in our foods than you do. She said, imagine how much that will all affect the brain and body, the mental health, the emotional health of the person, and then how they act in relationships. And she said, we don't look for ourselves in another person. Like we don't hitch up to others and lose our cool if they want to break up anymore because we're healthier inside and out. We just kind of have, she said, but more and more of us aren't always in long-term relationships. That's not frowned upon here. And I said, so, do you still have children? She said, oh yes. And that's only done with partnership in mind in a really sustainable, healthy, and happy way. And she said, for example, most people don't have more children than they can handle now. And she said, we do have laws and protections in place, but it's not like a rule. Like you're not capped at how many children you can have, but we have laws and protections also that protect women and children a lot more. So a woman cannot be made to have more children than she's comfortable with. She's not going to be made to carry a child that might have something that can't be genetically worked with that could be really harmful for her or the child, or put her in harm's way with her pregnancy. She's not required to carry that and just suffer the consequences. She said, women have a lot more autonomy. And she said, to be fair, a lot of men in our society accept that and they enjoy that. That's a privilege for them. They've realized it has a positive impact on them. And she said, a lot of people in your time period don't see it that way. They think it's a moral issue. They don't think about it as a science thing. And I was like, right, there's like a big separation. And she said also, when it comes to the family systems here, you have to understand there are much more relational norms here. And she said, so for example, if you have a multi-generational household, it's less likely you're going to have like a partner come and live in that and stay in that with you, right? And she said, so for many of us, she said it would be kind of awkward. And she said, so people are much more intentional with their dating. But many people here also have much more freedom and much more enjoyment. So they're not looking for joy just in a relationship, and they're not participating in as very unhealthy things in relationships as you might see in your society, because it's just not rewarding for them. It's not fun for them. Like she said, like most of us look at certain things and we're like, we kind of almost look at it as, why would you guys even do that? So when they learn about our time period, they're like, why on earth would you guys even do these things, right? Like, why would you guys participate in that? Why would you guys think that that's cool or okay or worth staying for? She said, that's exactly it. And I was saying to her in my mind, well, it would be like us looking at like Shelby mentioned, 250 years ago, women weren't allowed to like, in certain parts of the world, weren't allowed to be out in public seen with a man if she wasn't married to him, or chaperoned or whatever, like in Bridgerton or whatever. And she said, exactly, like there's certain things that you're like, I can't even imagine that. But during that time period, it was very real. And she said, there are certain things that you guys are allowing in your time period that you're awakening out of and moving out of very rapidly as societal norms in relationships that we look at and we're like, why would they even allow that? I can't believe they even live like that. And I was like, well, which ones? Tell me which ones. And she said, well, for instance, you allow men to have full freedoms with your autonomy and your power. And she was like, we don't have anything like, and there's no system like that allows men to control our bodies here. That's not even thought about. That's not even considered. She said, there are not men who think about that here. I was like, okay, that's awesome. And she said, like, it's not even it's not a desire for them. Like, and she said, a lot of men here go, I can't believe that was that way. Like, I can't believe. And she said, when you look back and you're like, well, I can't believe, these people would have, for example, like owned another human being, like owned them or thought that they owned them. She said, we don't have that here. Like we look at, those types of things, like where you guys still see certain things as like ownership and like property. And she said, I know that you don't have like slavery, but like you do have men who think that they own women's bodies or want to go to that. And she said, we don't even consider that an option. Like that's not even something that would cross our minds. And then she said, you guys also have certain things that she said, I don't want to stigmatize certain things because they're part of your process of evolution. And she said, but you guys have certain dating norms or cultural norms, for example, in the US that are really, really concerning. Like where we're like, I can't imagine. They're showing people just dropping out of like getting together, talking for a little while. And she's like saying like, yeah, the talking phase. And she put quotes around it. And she said like, where people just talk or they're just texting and they like hook up and then they like ghost each other. She said, we can't even fathom that. And she said, she said, well, we would look at it as like, wow, that vibrationally is such a low vibrational way to be. And she said, I understand some women see it as like power and sovereignty over their bodies because they have choice. And she said, that's an important part of the evolutionary cycle of women retaining autonomy and choice to do that. But she said, but to like essentially just to ghost out of connections, to be around people where there's no care, or like, they don't care about you. You don't care about them. She said a lot of that has really gone away because we realize that's a pretty low energy to exist in. And I was like, really? And she just goes, yeah. And she goes, because we are, again, we have a lot more health here and well-being. So for us, we are not looking to fix bad feelings or to fix low dopamine or stress levels by hooking up with random people. And she said, that's not really a thing in our society. And she said, for example, we never have non-consensual connections. That's not a thing here. She said, first of all, our technological systems, and she said, I'm not saying like big eye in the sky, but she said like those types of things can't happen here. And she said, if or when they ever do, they're rectified very, very quickly. Like there's things that are done immediately to adjust that or to fix that. And she said, no, it's not dystopian by any means. It's much more harmonious here. But she also said, we also have a lot of people here who just take time and care to get to know one another. They care. We have an understanding that this person is a soul. They have a spiritual self. They have an emotional self. They have mental health. They're a whole person. They're not an object. And she said, so again, we struggle sometimes to empathize and understand with why you guys would act these certain ways toward each other, but it all comes out of you all objectifying each other. She said that is not a thing here. We've evolved very far past that, which I think is really interesting. I'm like, wow, this is cool to hear. The other piece she said is, I want you to remember too, there were certain things that happened in the 200 years between your time period and my time period. There were certain things that happened that caused a lot of humanity to suddenly have to work together and band together. And this meant that people had to stop othering one another, and they started to go from me to we. And she said, that's happening in your time period already. You're already having this evolution of consciousness. You're having more people born understanding it innately. You're having more people where they come into society to demonstrate this. Like they're born to demonstrate this we mentality, not as like a culty thing, but like of course, like I care about other people that I don't know. Why would I not care about them? Like, I don't understand how some people like don't care about someone else's kids just because it's like not their own kid. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, that's just so bizarre to me. And she said, that's exactly it. We don't have that type of thinking of like, well, if you're not related, I don't care about you. And she said, we also don't have blind loyalty. We just have this understanding and interconnectedness to our ecosystem, to each other, to the larger earth. And she said, it's not perfect, but we do have more of that intuitive, intrinsic knowing. We're raised with it. Our parents understand it. It's very ingrained. We take care of ourselves and each other very well. And so that impacts how our relationships happen as well. They're very intentional. They're less frivolous. They're less flippant. And she said, again, like we look at your time period and we're like, how could you even think, like do those certain things? And she said, I don't mean it as a judgment, but more so as like, being from our part, history, just like you would look at things from 250 years ago and go, what is that? Like, why would you do that? Like, wow, I can't believe they lived like that. I'm so glad we don't have to. She said, we kind of see some of your relational styles the same way. And she said, also, again, you have to go through really intensive divorce processes, especially in your part of the world and in many parts of the world. It's very difficult to get a divorce. There's legal issues. There are custodial fights. There are things that happen with the finances. Like she said, it's like a legal battle. She said, we don't exist in that. We don't have those systems in place. There's much more protections for everyone involved, and women and children. We don't go through these same things. There's not as much of this me and mine. There are higher councils that help people sort things out and work things out when it's time for a split. She said there's also, again, more time, tenderness, and care and autonomy that exists for people within relationships. And she said your current time period, there's many people working toward that in your world and in society. She said there's also more recognized autonomy in terms of relationships. Like some people are, very much single by choice here. She said, I think that's what you guys call it. And I was like, yeah. And she goes, you're one of them. Like you're single by choice. And I said, yeah, I am. And she said, that's very common here. And she said, now we still have children. She said, she did a little wink and she said, but we don't have as much of this reliance on children and the significant other to make us happy. And that's really changed how we do things. It's much more intentional. We're not trying to fill some unmet need within ourselves by having a child. Like we have children and we know we want these children to be born and we love them. She said it's very different. We also have the village and the community because, again, we're much more community oriented and multi-generational. Housing and stuff like that allows us to raise children more easily. So she said many of us only have 1 or 2 children when we have them, and then they're raised by the community as well as the parents. So there's not just she said it's much more sustainable. It's much easier to raise a child. There isn't as much risk. There isn't as much, we don't have to choose between, affording a house or affording a family. She said we can have both, or affording, to live. She said we all live very well and very comfortably. And she said, again, with more of that communal style living, we have more of that autonomy in the end. And she said, it doesn't sound like it would lead to that, but it does, because we have the village that you have been looking for. So everything doesn't fall on one parent's shoulders or, just two people's shoulders or one parent's back. The community has their back. We have a lot more of that. She said, again, it's not a perfect system. There is certainly still things we're working out and we'll continue to work on over time and adjust to and fix. But there's much more of that autonomy for parents and for children. She said, we also don't have more children than we can take care of. And that's very important. We understand that not just spiritually, but energetically, how important that is for ourselves, our mental health, emotional health. And she said, for the economy, for the ecosystems, this is really something that's very good and sustainable. And she said also evolutionarily, there was a part in the process in which we started to realize like we can't really have more kids because there were changes in how many people were actually able to have children. She said, I don't want you to get concerned or worried. It wasn't like a big thing with she said there was no controls or programs around it or anything. She said it just sort of changed how we look at pregnancy and marriage. And she said all these things are interwoven. So it's important that we kind of look at them as a whole. They're a whole. There's larger pieces of a puzzle. She has a man who's starting to step in who almost wants to come in. She said, he is my teacher. He's my mentor. And he said, you can call me Roger. And he said, I will be here next time you're ready to tune in as well and to talk with us. And he said, I can talk. He's older. He's an older gentleman, fair skin, very, very his hair is going. He said, you can say it. It's white. He has glasses on. And he said, he's taller. He looks about 6'2", 6'3". He said, I'll come in and I'll talk more soon about many of the things in our society, in our culture that happen. He said, I have more of an anthropologic, historical understanding of things, whereas Anna has more of the impacts from renewable energy systems, and what she learned in school would be slightly different from what he said, I learned a little bit different facets of her history because I had a different educational path than she did. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. That makes total sense. Well, and he said, I'll come in with you next time. I said, okay. So I hope that you guys enjoy this episode. I know that it's a lot of information to take in, but I love how they try to be really thorough when they're explaining things and answering questions. So keep submitting your questions for Roger or Anna. It sounds like Roger will come in next time too. That was surprising. I just started to see him popping in and I was like, hello, do we have someone else here? So I hope that you guys enjoyed this. And if you have more questions, just submit them. Use the link in the show notes. You can record them or you can type them out and submit them in that way. And just get excited too, because I have my new podcast is coming out with another episode this upcoming week, and it's channeled messages from the other side from women that history tried to erase, and they're coming back from the dead to tell us things that they didn't get to tell from their lifetime. I know a lot of women had their their innovations undermined or claimed by men or erased from the history books, or sometimes they were just mentioned just barely in a history book, or whatever it is, and a lot of the good information was left out or even changed or, like I said, erased. And so I've been having women from the other side pop back in to channel and to talk with us about, spilling the spiritual tea about what's true, what's not. And a lot of them have really encouraging messages for us in this current time frame. They said it's a really revolutionary time frame, especially for women and children. So as we move into the changes that are coming, they want to help us with that. And so these women from from the past are coming through to share their words of wisdom and their afterlife perspectives with us. So I hope that you'll go listen to that. I've linked it up in the show notes as well. And then just a quick reminder, the Art of Channeling and the Art of Autowriting, my 2 summer courses are open. Go and check them out on the website. We'll be starting in mid-June for both of them. So you have some time to think on it. These are going to be great courses. The Art of Channeling is for people who want to learn lucid channeling and trance channeling. So think like what you see Abraham Hicks and Esther Hicks, Bashar, all of that good stuff channeling. And then the Art of Autowriting is awesome because you'll learn how to channel guides and teachers, ancestors, the loved ones on the other side, or even beautiful big ideas through the art of autowriting. It's a really cool process. A lot of people autowrite. It's much easier than you think. If you're like, well, I'm not sure if I can do it, I promise you can. So that one will be a great one for beginners and even intermediate students who are really wanting to get into it. But I hope you guys will come and join us. Both of those courses, I'm really excited for them. I've been channeling and autowriting for just over 10 years. So this is something my guides really were nudging me to teach. And I thought that I would, get those started. So anyhow, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. I hope you'll come and join us for the courses. And thank you so much.